Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 46 of the Let's Talk Yoga podcast. When I look back on my yoga journey, the one central aspect has been the role of my teachers and how they shared and passed on the teachings of yoga. And there is such a reverence and a special place for my teachers in my heart. And I strongly believe that the type of teachers you expose yourself to while learning asana or other parts of yoga will really determine the trajectory of where you go in the yoga world. And as a student, firstly, as a seeker, and then the quality of yoga teachers and what kind of a teacher you will become eventually if you choose to teach. So, on the show today, I have a very special guest, and we're talking about why the teacher student relationship matters in modern yoga with Kaya Mindlin. Kaya is the go to teacher for teachers seeking mature practice, authentic philosophy, and a therapeutic teaching pedagogy. She's been teaching for over 20 years, and she really works to uphold yoga's traditional roots. Her background includes a lot of formal study with teachers of the Vedic tradition. Her approach threads together storytelling, healing yoga, Vedic astrology, Ayurveda, Vedanta, Sanskrit, mantra, and tantra. She strives to make traditional teachings more meaningful and personal for modern life. Her nurturing, inclusive, and rich approach to wisdom and self love inspire others to deepen their lives, work, and practice. She's been teaching students from all over the world with courses in the Bhagavad Gita, Yoga Nidra, Karma, Mantra, and more. In today's conversation, we talk about the role of a yoga teacher. Can you self-study yoga? What qualities do you look for when you're trying to find a yoga teacher? Some of the problems in modern yoga, how the East and the West learn completely differently, and what the West can learn from the East, and just so much more. Kaya packs a lot into today's episode. I really hope you get value from this and that it helps you find the right teachers for you on your path. At the end, after we stopped recording, we were talking, and Kaya just wanted to add a little more. So at the end of the recording, you'll notice that we added a little chunk just to wrap things up. Enjoy today's show. I'll see you on the other side. Hi, my name is Arundhati, and you're listening to the Let's Talk Yoga podcast. I'm an ex-Bollywood dancer turned yoga and wellness educator. I've built a 6-figure business as an immigrant, woman of color yoga teacher with no business background, no handstands, pure instinct, and the free information found on Google. If you love doing yoga and you dream of teaching it someday, this podcast is for you. We go over everything from doing and teaching yoga to scaling a small business, living a modern yoga lifestyle, and so much more. You'll find interesting, fun, raw conversations along with some tips, tricks, strategies, and insights in this podcast. So grab your cup of chai and let's jump in. Hi, Kaya. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Arundhati. Nice to be with you.
Nice to see you here. I've been waiting to connect with you for so long. The conversation that we're going to get into today is about just the role of a yoga teacher, the teacher-student relationship, why it matters in modern yoga, and all of these things. To kickstart this conversation, Kaya, do you think it's possible to self-study yoga, or are there any pros and cons of just trying to do this by yourself?
Yeah, that's a good place to start. And I think it's good because it's something, especially now that everybody is, doing everything online and so on, it's coming up more and more. And modern culture is very do-it-yourself focused. And so why not do this yourself too? And the problem is that from the viewpoint of yoga itself, the yogic process happens within the container of the teacher-student relationship. And I've been thinking about, okay, what's a way that I can convey this? And so I thought of a little metaphor a few days ago, actually, if I can share.
Mm-hmm.
So if we imagine that we have a great recipe for a beautiful meal that we want to prepare, and the recipe is written, in 2-dimension, and the photos look beautiful and the descriptions are wonderful, and we think, I'm going to make that, and we get all the raw ingredients. So you have vegetables and rice and lentils or something like that, and you have all the raw ingredients now and the recipe. Well, now can you make the meal? Well, if we think about it, it looks at first like I have the recipe, I have the raw ingredients, and yet what's missing is the tools and the fire. Yeah. So you would need a pot, and you would need, a fire element of some kind. And so I think of it like this. It's like we as students of yoga, we are the raw ingredients. It's all there, right? It's all there within us. And the recipe we could think of like the teachings and the practices. But just those two alone, without the tools and the fire for transformation, nothing will happen. The meal won't be produced. So I kind of think of the fire as like the teacher, and the tools that you would use, spoon and knife and pot and so on. That is the teaching methodology, the pedagogy. And those are necessary for the actual transformation that we want. In the case of this meal, you need those to transform the raw ingredients into that recipe that's right now 2-dimensional, so that it becomes a meal that you can digest and that nourishes you. So that's kind of how I think of it. It's all there within you. That's in the teaching. You are the raw ingredients, and it's already there, whole and complete within you. And you have access to practices and teachings in 2-dimension, video and, shastra, texts, books, and so on. And yet, without the tools and the teacher, it can't really be, you can't be transformed.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I love that metaphor of the recipe. So as you were speaking, I was thinking of this, and I feel like in modern yoga and just with how we communicate in technology, we sometimes or often have access to too much information. And there is a gap between having access to, say, this yoga information, and it takes time for it to become knowledge and lived experience and wisdom in our own body, minds, and it's in our being. So it almost feels like, to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, it feels like this unlimited access when we are not ready is causing a lot of harm.
It's so true. Yeah, we have so much information. It's not just in yoga, right? It's in everything. And part of our problem is that I think we have a sense within us, we have this sense of inner urgency and inadequacy. I mean, this is what the yoga tradition itself describes as sort of the fundamental human problem, is this sense of not enough and inadequacy, which causes a kind of inner pressure and urgency. And we make a mistake when we use that urgency to then constantly grab at all of the information and every single practice, thinking that more is better, when in fact, yes, when it comes to yogic teachings and yogic practices in particular, we have this principle, as you surely know, called adhikari, which means you are meant to be ready for a practice or for a teaching so that it actually can have the impact that it's meant to and be integrated in a way that's non-harming and that can be accessed in a way that is right for the individual student. This is part of why a teacher is so helpful, because the teacher, a good teacher, can recognize what is the next best step and can also help the student slow down and and take time with things. I love when my students come to me and say, I'm just going to keep taking this one course that I did with you over and over and over again. And they're often surprised when they hear from me, oh, there's this one asana that I've been doing every day for 20 years. And it's the same asana that I teach my beginner students and my so-called advanced students. It's that repetition, that abhyasa of a few simple things that we are ready for. That's really where the magic happens. I think that grabbing at a million different things, it's a transactional attitude. It's a grasping attitude. And it's driven just by that sense of I'm not enough, and maybe driven by entertainment as well, that desire for entertainment, or to grab at, what my teacher would call experience hunting.
Oh, interesting. Experience hunting. So I want to go back to a couple of things you said there. I cannot agree more about I personally take this approach of less is more. If you stick with just a few practices, a few teachings of yoga, you can live your life completely just in that. And it is this inner urgency you spoke about. I've seen it so often. I always tell students, teachers of asana, that there's no expiry date on any of this. And you don't have to feel like, okay, by the end of these 3 months, I should be able to do X, Y, and Z. And it reminds me of, just how each student is at a different point. And we all come together in groups, but each one is at a different stage of learning and assimilation. And that has a lot of impact on, just how they will show up in at least the yoga world. But before we go there, I was wondering if you can elaborate on something you just said. You said something about a good teacher. So Kaya, in your understanding, who is a good teacher, or what qualities are we looking for in a good teacher or a teacher?
Yeah. This is the trick. I think, first of all, it may depend on what the teacher is teaching. And maybe even that itself is the quality of a good teacher. I think part of it is that a good teacher knows their role, and they're teachers that have different roles, a different purpose. So a teacher who is specializing, say, in accessible asana, this is a wonderful dharma. This is a great purpose. And if they have a good skill for that they are doing that skill. But if that teacher then, for the sake of wanting to, provide everything for their students, or their own inner urgency, or maybe a sense of kind of competition and ambition, starts teaching things that they don't have, knowledge in how to teach, that becomes very problematic and unethical. Maybe they want to hold on to their students. So I think maybe number one is that the teacher teaches what they are meant to teach, what they have the capacity to teach. They're not going outside their scope, we might say it in modern terms. I think the next quality of a good teacher is that the teacher is in service, right? The teacher is in service to really two things. The teacher is in service to the student or the students, and the teacher is in service to the teaching. So the teaching is actually superior to the teacher. So that ability to, or quality of being in service, is so fundamental to the teacher. And along with that, I think what that means is that the teacher, when it comes to yogic teachings and practices, the yoga teacher cannot be driven then by personal agenda, right? It's not for the sake of the teacher, it's for the sake of the student and for the sake of the teachings and the practices. So being free from personal agenda. Now, we could talk about an enlightened being as, permanently, utterly free from personal agenda at all times. But to those who are, say, an asana teacher or something in that realm, at the minimum, be free from agenda for that hour. Be free from a personal agenda for that, 2 hours or whatever the length of time is that you're teaching. You can take at least an hour to be free from personal agenda. And then I think the third thing that goes with that is that the teacher is adhering to or conforming to principles of Dharma, we might call ethics, or being in accord with natural order, or upholding what is right. The most essential of which is no unnecessary harm. So that means that there's no exploitation, there's no commodification. They're conforming to Dharma. So I think maybe that's 4 things. One is a teacher teaches what they should be teaching, what they are meant to do, what they have a capacity for. 2 is that they're in service to the student and the teaching. And 3, there's no personal agenda. And then 4, which is really because of all of those things, the teacher is conforming to ethics, to Dharma, to non-harming, essentially.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. There's one thing you said in just passing, which was so beautiful. The teaching is superior to the teacher. And that is, for me, that's like, I hope people really just pause on that one thought, because I've always said, you serve yoga. And not, it's you do everything you do in your teaching or studying journey, keeping the yoga in mind and how we're transitioning and passing it down. So these 4 points, they're really powerful. Can I press you a little more on Dharma? And I know we weren't really going to go into Dharma, but it's coming up here. How can one not just get confused about, passion and dharma, or their niche and dharma? And how can we not loosely just say, often I've heard teachers saying, or people saying, teaching yoga is my dharma. And I'm like, is teaching asana what you're talking about, or a certain aspect? How do we not get confused or misled by just this dharma and teaching yoga?
Yeah. I mean, this word dharma, it's so fundamental to this whole conversation, in my view. And it's really so fundamental to yoga. Yoga, in my view, rests on the foundation of dharma. So of course it comes up, and it's my passion. So whatever I talk about in every conversation, it seems to come up. I think we have to really, first, let's just say what dharma is for the listeners, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So to explain dharma, we have to have this other little word, vrta. Vrta is this ancient term that means cosmic order. That everything in the manifestation is ordered in a particular way that is mostly unseeable to us, but the patterns of nature and the universe, and including your body and mind and so on. And dharma means that which holds or upholds. So dharma really means everything that we do in our choices, in our actions, that uphold that cosmic order. And that means in a more kind of a universal way, so sort of universal principles such as, kindness and compassion and thoughtfulness and all of those things. And then in a more individual way, it is what most people, modern people and Western people, commonly refer to as dharma. They're thinking of svadharma, which means my dharma, my personal purpose. So in a small way, that's also how you uphold the cosmic order, because we each have a role to play. But I think in the time of commodification, in the time of being career-driven and so on, we've confused this concept of personal dharma, personal responsibility and purpose, with career, with how I generate money. Yeah. And so I think people mistake the word, the concept of career or profession or passion, as you say, with svadharma, when in fact, sometimes my svadharma as a mother is to change a diaper, to cook a meal. That's also individual purpose. It's, doing the dishes and so on is also part of it's really about your personal responsibility. And sometimes your svadharma, in fact, much of the time, our svadharma is not something we want to do. So we confuse, what you said, my passion. So I think people make the mistake of confusing their likes, their dislikes, their preferences, their passion for, that's my dharma. And sometimes what is your purpose, you also like and feel passionate about. And I just say that's luck. That's very lucky if we like and have passion for our dharma. Yeah. So that's a little bit of a beginning of that.
No, that's great. You could have gone on and I'd still be sitting here nodding behind the microphone that you can't see. But so it's so true. I'm so glad you brought up your svadharma, your personal thing versus your career, and how we sometimes over identify probably with certain aspects of our life, and that kind of messes things up. Now, Kaya, what about the Eastern and Western ways of learning? They are very different. What do you think that the West can learn from the East when it comes to studying these ancient traditions and practices?
Yeah. I think this came up a little bit ago, that Eastern and Western, one of the main differences, I think, is, the West is very interested in what is new, right? what is unique and new and utterly different. So, for example, sort of in the West, the highest level of accomplishment in thought is a PhD. And what is a PhD? You have to have a new idea, something no one's thought of. And in the East, we might think the highest accomplishment of thought is the ability, say, to recite the Vedas the way they've been recited for thousands of years, to do practices in a particular way, to, this concept of repetition of something that is time-tested and valuable. And of course, through each person, it's unique, but that one of the differences, I think, is constantly generating something new from the viewpoint of the West versus the repetition of something that is old and timeless and time-tested in the East. I think another difference is that transactional attitude versus transformational. So if I'm transactional in my learning and my personal development, which is more kind of Western, it's, I've read all these books, so I check it off the list. I've done these practices. I've advanced in this linear way. I used to do this practice and now I do this one, and now I've advanced to this one. And I've read, I'll get emails from people that said, I read the Bhagavad Gita. Now I want a translation of all of the Upanishads so I can go through those. Yeah. That sound is the one I make in my head when I get this. And it's coming from a beautiful place, which is that there's a desire to grow and to learn, but it's misguided because we're just like, I say, okay, now what do you understand from the Bhagavad Gita that you've read? And of course, there's very little understanding. So this checking things off the list, like grabbing that transactional and kind of trying to eat practices and information instead of letting them, having that yogic knowledge and yogic practice actually be transformational. So that difference between what is information and that which can actually give us illumination. So that the difference is, it's not about, oh, now I know this, or now I've done this, or I've experienced this. It is, oh, wow, this is how I'm actually a different person. My relationships are changed. My inner attitude is changed. My viewpoint is changed. That looking for, not what do I know and what did I experience on the hand of the sort of the Western approach to learning, but how did I undergo a change? How am I transformed?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. In India, we grew up with this saying, we would just, as kids, we would joke about it and we would say, old is gold.
Yes.
And it's so simplistic, but as you were speaking, I actually wrote down old is gold. I haven't said it out loud in like a long time, but it's true, this timelessness. And we almost were always taught that this is old. There is a certain reverence because this has stood the test of time. And I love how you said, it's all these new shiny things. What's next? And that transactional versus transformation. It almost sounds like, if I may say this, on the West, we are looking for a lot of external recognition and rewards. And whereas a lot of yoga teachings are telling you, hey, go inward. That is where the real reward is. There's no real reward in the traditional sense of a reward, but it just reminded me of old is gold.
And I love old is gold. I love it. Yeah, as you're speaking as well, it's making me think too. I think another big difference is, and this may be more really the modern Western approach to learning, is that the modern Western approach to learning, very often what happens is the students are driving the teaching and the practice as much as the teacher, or the students. In other words, the students, how can I say this? It's like a conversation. So we see, let's take yogic philosophy, which is something that I teach. So in the Western approach, we see this a lot in a YTT program, that often the teacher of these programs isn't actually a dikari, isn't prepared to be a teacher of philosophy. And so what happens in a YTT program often is it's a conversation. Everyone sits in a circle, they read a sutra or a shloka, and then everyone takes a turn sharing their viewpoint, their perception, right? Their understanding of it, their feelings about it. And it's a kind of equal time from between the students and the teachers. Whereas in the East, in fact, the students are in a position of receptivity. The students are listening. It's Shravana is the Sanskrit word. The whole tradition rests on receptivity and hearing, listening to teachings or being receptive to practices. And so, the students are very quiet in the Eastern context, and the teacher is primarily doing the talking. We see this in the Bhagavad Gita. If we look at the Gita, what happens is the first chapter, which is Gita is, for students or listeners who don't know, is this conversation between the teacher, Krishna, and the student, Arjuna. And Arjuna goes on and on for the first chapter, and into the second chapter, he's having a crisis, and it's mostly the student talking. And the teacher doesn't speak, because the other thing about this teacher-student relationship is it rests on consent. The student has to ask for the teaching. So Krishna doesn't speak. And Arjuna goes on and on. The student's going on, his crisis, his problem, his tailspin. And then finally, when Arjuna asks Krishna to teach him, then Krishna opens his mouth. He doesn't open his mouth until well into the second chapter. Then once the gates open and Krishna is now being asked to be in the teacher position and teach, then mostly Krishna speaks and Arjuna's quiet. Arjuna's receptive. And then when he has a question or a concern or a doubt or a confusion, he speaks up and Krishna responds, and then Arjuna gets quiet again. So I think that's another difference is in the East, the students are more in a receptive place.
Mm-hmm. It's so true. I was thinking back to when I used to go to Yogashala, and we would not speak at all, Kaya. It was Mauna. The moment you started walking towards the gates of the Shala, we would just be silent. And it was part of what we were taught to do, to keep that Mauna, so all our senses are ready to and primed to listen and learn and absorb and assimilate. But it was almost like, in the way I understood it, is I had no knowledge compared to this master who spent his lifetime in seeking this knowledge and understanding it and taking the time and effort to simplify it so we could understand it. And I have no problem with hierarchy of teachers. I till date, when I'm standing in front of my teacher, there are no words that come out of my mouth, because I'm just like, what will I say in your presence that is even worthy of your time? That's how I see it. But I don't think that, well, let me not say I don't think. I actually think having a hierarchy of teachers and guides and masters that we could go to at different stages of our learning is extremely beneficial. But somehow I feel like if I say that, it's almost like someone's ego will get hurt. That how do you say that all teachers are not equal? I don't know can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, this is a big question right now in yoga land, I think. And I think people misinterpret, people that are outside of the tradition, that haven't been born and raised in that tradition or spent a lot of time in it and, understand what you're talking about from the inside. They hear what you're talking about, and I think some people misinterpret it as it's disempowering, or the students are infantilized, and that the teacher is in control of the students, and that because I think we hear it from the viewpoint of thinking that the hierarchy that you're talking about has this permanent, constant risk of exploitation, as opposed to dharma. And it's a very deep misunderstanding, and it's just coming from it's not coming from the inside of it. From the inside viewpoint, this idea that you're talking about is about reverence, that receptivity that we're talking about. It goes with reverence for the teaching, and then reverence for the teacher, because the teacher is the vehicle, like we talked about. The teacher is that fire, and the teaching is those tools for making the meal. So we're quiet with our teachers because we have such reverence for that process, and because we're hungry for it. It's like if you are hungry for a meal, back to the meal, you don't just sit there and talk to the meal. You're so hungry for it that you just eat up the meal. And in fact, even in Indian culture as well, what happens at a meal that's very disconcerting to Westerners, is that Indian people, there's not a lot of talking at a meal. You just eat because you're hungry, you eat. It's better for digestion. You're receiving the blessing of the food. You're having reverence for the food, and you eat. And, it's the same, I think, when we're being with a teacher. We have such hunger for the teaching and such reverence for the teacher that we're just eating it up, or we're drinking it with our ears, and we just can't get enough of it, that it wouldn't even cross your mind to say something, because you don't want to stop the flow of that nectar and nourishment that is
so
the
true.
teaching.
So true. It's when I moved here, it's been about 8.5 years. And I still remember I used to go to asana classes because I was still trying to figure out who can be my teacher here and stuff like that. And I came back the first few classes from studios, and I was telling my husband, I'm like, the teachers and students, they talk to each other like they're friends. And it was just so bewildering to me, because I grew up in a very formal teacher-student relationship, and none of it was forced. I want to make that very clear. Everything was optional. You came there out of choice. My teachers were always, in many ways, they lived the practice so effortlessly, so kind, so nurturing. So I would just come home and be like, how do they even, I wouldn't make eye contact with some of my teachers, just because, I would be like, okay, you are beyond what I can get to in any lifetime. But I would just be like, they talk to each other, they hug each other. It was just completely such an alien experience, but it stuck with me. And I figured out how America is very informal in so many ways. And we, with Indian culture and British influence, we're so formal. Anyway, just had to say that.
Yeah. It's so funny. It's so true. And I think there's a way to have a balance, being in this culture, and I see you doing this, to have that reverence, and that there is a formality. It's not a two-way equal relationship. Not that one is better than the other, but one is in the position of conveying something and the other is in the position of receptivity. That, but there is a way to sort of, feel that intimacy, which is a part of the teacher-student relationship, and also have there be a degree of like an appropriate separation. It's not a friendship. It is a friendship in that we are, seekers together, and we are, interested in yogic things together, but it's not this two-way street the way people want it to be. But I think it's so important for us to talk about this. It is kind of an elephant in the room that right now there is for sure a bit of a deconstructing of, or even a lashing out at the culture and the tradition of the teacher-student relationship, as though it is intrinsically exploitive and problematic at the fundamental. And this is not the case. So we could talk about that, but we did talk a little bit about the Dharma of a teacher. When you and I are talking about the teacher-student relationship, we know that the fundamental basis of that is that concept of Dharma, that we're talking about a teacher that is ethical, that has knowledge, that sees that the teachings are superior, that is in service to the teachings and the students. So we're not talking, obviously, about a person that is exploitive, who really should not be in the teacher position, which happens, but it's not the rule. It's an occasional problem that does happen.
I completely agree. And I think we also have this almost bad habit of only taking these people who have been exceptions and pretending like that is the norm. I personally think I have a lot of regard for the Guru Shishya Parampara. And in I have seen it work, and it is beautiful in how it's been constructed. So do you want to talk a little more about the Guru Shishya Parampara and its relevance to modern yoga students? Because what we have in a YTT, that's not Guru Shishya Parampara. And what we even learn in a YTT, that's not even all of yoga. So what's your take on the Guru Shishya Parampara?
Okay, Guru Shishya Parampara. Let's say the English too. So the Guru is the teacher, but big word Guru means, right, the one who removes darkness or helps remove ignorance. How do they do that? They're not performing some kind of magic trick. They're using a teaching methodology and time-tested practices that help the student to mature, and the student is actually, that's revealing the truth of the student's own nature. So that's the Guru, that removing ignorance so that the student for themselves, that the truth of their being is revealed. So, and the Shishya is the student. And then Parampara is this lineage, is described as, from teacher to student, eternally flowing like a river from the very beginning of time all the way to now. And it's, to those who scoff at this concept, it's ironic, because the only reason that we have these teachings and practices so many thousands of years later today is because of the Guru Shishya Parampara. Otherwise, it wouldn't be here for us now. So anyone who's practicing yoga should have some reverence to that concept. So this is what it is. It is that it's really everything that we're talking about, that the teacher has a responsibility to continue the flow of that river of those teachings and practices by conveying them to students via a relationship of consent. In other words, the student wants these teachings and is asking or going to that teacher for those teachings and practices. So there's consent is built into it, and all the ethics that we've been talking about are built into that teacher, not having personal agenda and so on. And that teacher then sort of pours that river down to the student. And then as the student develops over time, if it is their svadharma, it flows out of them in some way. Maybe they share it with friends and loved ones, or maybe they just live it and are a model for it. Maybe they, become a teacher themselves, and that's that parampara continually flowing. Without that, there really is none of these teachings and practices that we hold so very dearly. And yeah, it's really not what's happening in a YTT program. And that's okay, I think, as long as we acknowledge, as you're doing, like we say, that's not what's happening. The teachers primarily, most teachers in a YTT program are not a guru. They're really giving more some information, some practices. In an ideal world, maybe that wouldn't be the setup. Maybe we would hold these teachings and practices more precious, but at least we could hope that those teachers, teaching teachers in a YTT, it would be really nice if those teachers were, had a teacher themselves and were part of the Guru Shishya Parampara themselves. That would be ideal. And that they are, they're playing the role of maybe helping to awaken that desire for deeper knowledge in the students of a YTT program, so that maybe those students go on to seek more. I really think of it like a process of maturing. Wherever we are in our lives, wherever we are as practitioners of yoga, as students of yoga, that this is really about maturation. And as we mature, what happens is we become a seeker. We become not just someone that's grabbing at a practice or grabbing at a profession or grabbing at an experience, but become somebody who's really seeking to understand, what is the true nature of myself? What is the true nature of all of this existence? And that seed of seeking within us that matures and grows over time leads us ultimately to seek a teacher who can help us, reveal what we're really seeking.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I'm glad you paused on just this whole YTT and what happens in a YTT. And while I think there's no doing away with teacher trainings, right? We can definitely do better. And it's something I'm really, you know, passionate about. I try to educate people about it because I did teacher trainings in India, Kaya, and they made such an impact on me. And I just think that teachers have to be so clear on what they are not teaching and what they are teaching, and to acknowledge that you can't learn all of this in a few months. And if anybody's trying to tell you they can teach you all of that in just a few months without understanding the different level of seekers, and each one will have a different area of interest or not interested at all after a certain point, it's so important. But I'm not going to go off track. I just wanted to say that we as teachers have to learn that there are people who come into these programs who are very sincere. They're seeking the knowledge, but are they seeking all of it, or are they seeking just they're interested in asana and hence they are there? And that's not a bad thing as long as we clarify exactly where we are and what the goals are. I don't know, maybe I'm going off on a tangent here, but I think for teachers to realize that we need to stop pretending, and we need to say, this is what I don't know, this is what I'm still learning, and this is what I can do in this training with you. And you don't have to be forced to teach, because that's not what this is about.
Yes, I'm sure you know I'm with you 100% on this. And I actually really, because I teach a lot of teachers, and you do as well, and I teach a lot of teachers who have, often even, completed 500 hours or 800 hours as a yoga therapist and so on, that I really see that much of the time, this problem, which is a very serious problem that you're talking about in Yoga Land and in YTT programs, which is that people are misguided into thinking that they know more than they know, that they have capacities to teach things that they really don't have a capacity to teach.
Absolutely.
That is coming from unfortunately, a lot of the teachers of the YTT programs. What I see is that the students, as you said, the students going into these programs, most of them, some of them are coming like, oh, this is a career. But, if you want to just make money, most people will find a different career, because this is...
Oh, I hope so.
There are, other ways to make much more money, right? So I think most people are not thinking when they go into a YTT program, they may think, I want to teach and I want to share yoga, and maybe it's a profession. But I don't think that's really I think most people going in these programs have that seed of being a seeker. In fact, the surveys have shown that the majority of people going to YTT programs don't plan to teach. They just want to understand yoga more deeply. And this commodifying setup that we have in the West means that the only way for most people to do that is to go to a YTT program. And so I think that you're right. The teachers of YTT and teachers in general in the yoga world who have some level of sort of influence and mastery, it would be so wonderful if they would acknowledge the limitation of a 200, 300, 500, even 800-hour program, and also acknowledge what is the original seed that brought us to these programs of seeking, and grow that, cultivate that. And if teaching or a profession is a side effect because it's someone's individual dharma, that's wonderful, and that should be nourished and nurtured as well. But I can't tell you how many of my students over the years have come to me and said how disappointed they were in their YTT program, how they went with an open heart, with a seeking, with a hunger for knowledge, and then they were fed something that was very small or had the wrong focus or is really distorted and disturbed, but they were so convinced by the teachers that was yoga. It was very confusing to them. They're going in thinking, I think yoga is about this. And then they get fed certain things in a YTT program and they digest it like digesting, junk food. And some of them get on board with it even for a couple of years and end up being on the verge of even quitting yoga as a practice altogether, because it's turned into something that they feel is, it's so distorted and disturbed from what they were originally seeking. It's so common that so my point being long-winded that we both go on a rant, that I think the seed is there in most of the students, and it's the yoga industrial complex, or what I just call Yoga Land, that's actually being responsible for a lot of distortion and disturbance and confusion and sidetracking people that began as seekers, because that's what's out there.
Mm-hmm. So true. And I love all these long-winded answers. Don't worry about it one bit. But, I was always taught this. The student is always sincere. Now, can the teacher meet the student where they're at? And if that means you super simplify something, or you go do the work you need to because the caliber of your student is, adhimatra, like exceptional, then, or you send them to another teacher who can meet them where they're at. And I'm glad you paused on it and we're talking about it, because I think these conversations of these trainings are not going away, but making people realize that you can't just be fed somebody's interpretation of something as yoga is really important. And I think that's why yoga teacher trainings in a very small way shouldn't be even called teacher trainings. They should be just study immersions with an optional tail end of, if you want to teach, here's the additional work you can do, but you are teaching asana. And that is where we are starting. Whether you like it or not, that is where we start. And then you chip away at it and find other teachers and yeah, anyway, I can get really passionate about
Me too.
This particular topic. So I think it's to remember that the student who's in front of you, and can you take them further along in their journey as seekers, that is the main point. It is not about can they teach what you think they have to teach by the end of the training, because that's what the industry expects.
Yes. And it all goes back to that urgency and that, capitalizing on something instead of slowing down and going, well, why am I really here in the first place? We've really lost that value for what you're talking about, which is just studentship and stewardship and remembering to be a student and a practitioner first. And that, yes, in fact, YTT 200, as was established by the Yoga Alliance in the US, originally, that was actually on the inside, from the inside of that organization. Now it's changed, but originally it was understood that that was actually only designed, really, it was about graduating from those programs meant you are a practitioner of yoga with an established practice, an established understanding of the purpose of yoga, and so on. That's really what those 200 hours should be focused on, as a foundation of becoming a practitioner, becoming a sadhaka, a practitioner of yoga, a seeker of yoga. And then as we mature, maybe you want to share and you get pedagogy in addition to that. And I agree. I wish that we would be more clear that that's really what 200 hours has the capacity to do. And that we shouldn't immediately turn a practice into something that now we're selling. This just came up in a conversation I was having yesterday about when is somebody actually a teacher. And, people in the West don't want to hear this, but the yoga tradition itself says that you become a teacher of something when there's two kind of ways into being a teacher of three, let's say. One is 12 years. A 12-year committed practice and engagement with something is what is required before you should teach it. And that's way longer than people want, because we're always in a hurry and we want to turn it into a profession and we want to quit our day job and blah, blah, blah. But the tradition itself says 12 years to prepare a teacher. And then the other piece is that person's teacher says, gives their blessing and gives their encouragement and says, you should teach. And that takes time, and people don't want to take time.
So true. We live in this world of instant gratification, and we see that so much in yoga. In front of me, I have a list, Kaya, of just in Hinduism, how we have different levels of teachers, like gurus and acharyas and upadhyayas and pradhyapakas. And we have this list of this, again, I'm going back to the word hierarchy because I can't think of another word. But I remember when I'm still always a beginner student in yoga, but when I used to keep going back to my teacher, And I used to do the same trainings again and again and again. And he at one point told me, and I had moved here by then, and he told me, don't come back. I want you to take this, try to teach it. He was largely referring to asana, and take it, teach it, go do this in the real world, share it, and come back when you feel like it's the next point in your journey. And I haven't gone back since, because I'm still trying to implement what he asked me to do. And I think that's a beautiful thing. I just sometimes wonder, where does it get lost in translation, probably? And I think I don't mind going slow, but I do think there are so many other factors involved. Like, I don't even want to get into social media and stuff like that, because that's a different whole. But yeah.
Yeah. And how beautiful. I love that story about your teacher saying, don't come back now, go share. That's exactly what I'm talking about. And of course, yes, I acknowledge, and even I teach teachers, I teach pedagogy, and you do as well. And of course, we encourage our students to go and share what they've learned with integrity, with ethics and so on. So I think as well, when I'm talking about 12 years, you might start teaching before then. But I've told so many of my students, and they've watched it happen, that you will also see, you may start teaching in a small way before 12 years, of course. Okay, that's fine. You've done YTT and you have all this training, and people are asking you to share, so you teach. But everyone will see, when you reach that 12-year mark, something does shift within you, in your teaching, in how you're able to be with students in the way that we're talking about. And then, oh my God, what will happen after another, 12 years? So this value for letting ourselves mature as students, letting ourselves mature as teachers, and then seeking teachers who are mature. Because so much of the work that I do is really helping. Actually, one of my teachers would say that he was installing in us a BS meter.
BS?
So that BS, I don't want to curse on your podcast. So
sorry. I was like, that's the only BS I know. Yeah. I was like, what are you talking about?
Yeah. So helping us to navigate when something is right, when something is apt as a teaching and as a teacher, versus when, we're being tricked or teachings are being distorted. And some teachers distort teachings without even knowing that they're doing it.
So true.
So much of my work, I feel, is to help students have a navigating system within themselves, to take time to look for a teacher, to choose a teacher wisely, to have ethics and consent and all of that in there. And so I think, yes, we might start teaching a little bit earlier than 12 years, but we also will see that we mature. And then as we are maturing, we're also ourselves seeking teachers that have maturity, that will take time with things, and that we'll see in us when we're ready to share something. For example, I teach some mantras, but I never did that until my teacher said, and like you, I was like, really? And she said, okay, you go teach this mantra now. I find that the students that are, that have ethics and integrity are often the ones that are sort of the most hesitant, because like, you had to be told, you had to be pushed out the door, because you had so much reverence for it and so much value for what you were being given, and you were in integrity. It gave you cause to hesitate before you shared it with others. I always think that's such a good sign in a teacher.
It's like, I don't tell my teacher about the teacher trainings I do, the podcast I do. I keep all of that in some way almost hidden, because I'm almost shameful in a very nice way. It's not a negative feeling that, anyway, because I'm an ant on this journey. But I want to ask you, and maybe we'll close here unless you have anything else to add. We've been talking about ethics, and I think it is the foundation for a student and more so for a teacher. For someone listening, Kaya, how or where can they learn these ethics if they're like, what, I don't think I've gotten this in my journey so far? How can they make this a part of their being? Because I still believe most yoga teachers, asana teachers, they're very sincere and they're seeking, they're just not finding the resources.
Right. So these what we can call yogic ethics or principles of Dharma, they're very much built into the tradition, and they're taught in the tradition in texts which have to be taught by teachers who have a method for teaching those texts. There, one source in particular that conveys certain yogic ethics is the Bhagavad Gita. There's a section which you'll surely know, which is called the 20 Jnanam. And so those 20 Jnanam, 20 values, they're not rules, right? We tend to think, Western people, I think, tend to think of ethics as right, wrong, good, bad. But it's more about values, and they're values that are associated with what makes me available for wisdom. And so this is called the 20 Jnanam, or the 20 values. They're taught in the Bhagavad Gita. You should learn them from a teacher who teaches these things, because otherwise you can be easily misguided when you try to read it yourself or something. So in other words, in the context of the student-teacher relationship itself, which you take time to choose and all of that, then you learn through the teacher teaching those values, relying on a text, relying on the oral tradition, and also by modeling what is ethical. I would say, in the one sense, there's a complexity to it. What are these yogic ethics? But also, on the other hand, it's very simple, because the yoga tradition will explain that Dharma is inbuilt in each of us, right? Because it's cosmic, it's about this cosmic organizing, principles of reality. So in other words, I, as a living being, know that I do not wish to be harmed or hurt. So therefore, I can extrapolate that no other being wishes to be harmed or hurt. That is the most fundamental yogic ethic that has to do with upholding cosmic order. So if we, at the minimum, we start by going to that, then what we do in our actions and in our choices and in our teaching, we pause, we slow down our reaction time. We make love the foundation, and tending to the tradition, tending to students as our kind of primary guiding light. Then we slowly teach what is appropriate to those who are asking for it, with consent on board, upholding this idea of, I do not wish to be hurt, therefore I would not do anything that hurts someone else. And then to do that, though, requires that we slow down. What my teacher would say is, your actions in the beginning to be in accord with Dharma, you have to act slowly and deliberately. Another one of my teachers would say, you have to walk around the situation first, right? And then you choose your action. And over time of doing that, that will keep you in accord with Dharma, in accord with ethics, slowing down, walking around the situation, choosing deliberately based on not harming, not tricking, not exploiting, not manipulating. And then over time, all of that becomes very natural and spontaneous.
Beautiful. I hope this really resonates with all the teachers teaching. It's like we try to teach everyone like their teachers. And I think that is where we're fundamentally flawed, because we think the teacher's journey has to be the student's journey. But thank you so much, Kaya. This has been really wonderful. And I will link to where people can connect with you and everything else in the show notes. But thank you so much for sharing with us today.
Thank you, Arundhati. It was such a pleasure.
Okay. Kaya, do you want to add what you were just telling me when we stopped recording?
Sure. So we were really talking about this idea that, where we're coming from with this conversation is that we love this tradition, and we love yoga students, and we love yoga teachers. We really want everyone to be doing their svadharma and holding up, this beautiful tradition. And so I think, this idea of teaching within your scope that we returned to a few times in our chat, it's so important. And it's not to criticize teachers or to shame teachers, but I think it actually can take the pressure off. We really want to take the pressure off of teachers and say, it's okay to teach what you know and teach it over and over and over again. There's so much value in that. And your students love it. You don't need to entertain them. You don't need to be everything for everyone. You can be yourself, and who that is will grow over time. And I think it's actually we want to give permission to teachers to take the pressure off and teach what you really know from your heart.
Mm-hmm. That is so important. Just, you don't have to be everything to everyone. And every step, I always ask people, teachers, to be like, do you have clarity? Do you have absolute clarity? Like if I wake you up at 2 a.m. and ask you to do this, do you have clarity? Till you get to that point where you know it not in your head, but in your body, in your breath, in your being, then you go to the next thing. Otherwise, you're just going to overburden yourself. And that comes across as confusion for the student. So yeah, I'm glad you added this.
Yeah, me too. Thank you.
If you're one of the faithful listeners of the show, thank you for making it all the way to the end. It always means a lot that you listen till the very end of the podcast. I hope you had as much of a learning and insightful experience from this conversation as I did. As always, thank you so much for tuning in. I'll see you next week with a brand new show and a new guest. Until then, take care. Bye-bye.